You've been listening to Boring Past Times, where history wanders slowly and softly, like the hush of fading footsteps in an old hall. The dollar princesses glittered for only a brief moment, caught between the new wealth of America and the fading grandeur of Europe. Their stories remind us that even the grandest marriages could not hold back time. Thank you for joining this quiet journey into the past. Until next time, may history's gentle rhythms guide you toward rest and dreams. If you had been one of those young heiresses in 1895, the glitter of your American world might have seemed eternal. Yet, across the Atlantic, another story was unfolding, one of faded grandeur, drafty castles, and noble families balancing precariously on the edge of financial ruin. For centuries, the aristocracy of Europe had embodied wealth, power, and prestige. But by the late 19th century, many noblemen discovered that their coats of arms could no longer keep the roof from leaking or the creditors from knocking. This decline would become the foundation of an unlikely bargain: titles for money, heritage for fortune, and marriages that bound to very different worlds together. The agricultural crisis and the fall of landed wealth to understand the desperation of many European aristocrats. You must picture the vast country estates that had once been the heart of their fortunes. Sprawling fields, tenant farms, and hunting grounds provided steady income for generations. But in the late 19th century, a global agricultural crisis changed everything. Cheap grain imports from America and Russia flooded European markets, driving down prices. Farming, once the backbone of aristocratic wealth, became increasingly unprofitable. Dukes and earls, who had long depended on tenant rents, suddenly faced empty coffers to keep their estates running. Many nobles sold off art, jewels, and even sections of their land. But the expenses of aristocratic life, maintenance of great houses, staff wages, stables, and social obligations were immense. The income simply wasn't enough. By 1895, it was not unusual to find a titled noble with a famous family name, but an estate crumbling around him. The grandeur of the old world persisted in name and ceremony, but financially it was cracking at the seams. Titles without fortunes despite their money troubles. Aristocrats still possessed one priceless commodity: titles. To be a duke, marquis, or earl was to hold a form of social currency that new money in America could not buy. A Vanderbilt or an Astor could be wealthier than a king, yet in London society they were still outsiders, laughed at as parvenus, upstarts without pedigree. A titled marriage offered American families exactly what they craved: legitimacy. By aligning their fortunes with ancient names, they could transform raw money into social prestige. It was, in truth, a market exchange: dollars for dukedoms, fortunes for family trees. And it was in this uneasy balance that the idea of the dollar princess was born. London's social season, a marketplace of marriages, if Newport and New York were the stages of American display, then London's season was the great marketplace of European aristocracy. Each spring, noble families descended upon the city for a whirlwind of balls, dinners, garden parties, and races at Ascot. For months, carriages clogged the streets, while the gilded drawing rooms of Mayfair hosted dances until dawn. This was not simply entertainment. The season was designed to bring young aristocrats together to arrange marriages that would preserve bloodlines and fortunes. But by the 1890s, those marriages increasingly involved American heiresses. Their entrance into London society was often met with raised eyebrows. British ladies whispered about their manners, their accents, and their flashy American ways. Yet beneath the gossip, many noble families were relieved. A wealthy bride from across the Atlantic could settle debts, repair roofs, and restore hunting lodges. It was a trade that everyone recognized, even if few admitted openly notable matches. The first waves of dollar princesses, one of the earliest and most famous examples, was Jenny Jerome, the spirited daughter of a New York financier. In 1874, she married Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. Jenny brought a significant dowry, and her marriage soon linked her to British politics. Her son, Winston Churchill, would become one of Britain's most important leaders. Another was Consuelo Iznaga, a Cuban-American heiress who married into the British Spencer Churchill family in 1876. Her friendship with Alva Vanderbilt helped set the stage for Alva's daughter's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. A generation later, by the 1890s, these examples had become models. Mothers, like Alva Vanderbilt, actively schemed to secure similar matches. Their daughters would not only wear tiaras at court, but also breathe new life into struggling noble families. The costs of aristocratic life. It's easy to imagine that once an American heiress married into nobility, her money simply paid for new dresses and grand dinners. But the reality was much heavier. Maintaining an estate in Britain was an expensive, endless task. Staff. A great house might employ dozens of servants, butlers, footmen, cooks, maids, gardeners, gamekeepers, and grooms. Their wages and housing consumed vast sums. Repairs, drafty. Castles and country houses were constant drains. Roofs leaked, chimneys needed repair, and centuries-old stonework required upkeep. Social obligations. Entertaining was not optional. A duke or earl was expected to host lavish dinners, hunting, parties, and balls. To cut back was to risk social embarrassment. For many noble families, marrying an American heiress was the only way to sustain their way of life. Without her dowry, the ancestral home might slip into disrepair, or worse, be sold to an industrialist. The heiress's position, but what was it like for the heiress herself, stepping into this world? She might have dreamed of castles, titles, and glittering balls, but often she found herself in drafty, cold houses where the glamour quickly gave way to reality. She was expected to manage vast households, oversee servants, and adapt instantly to customs that were foreign and strict. Where in Newport she had been celebrated for her wealth, in England she was often dismissed as the American. Her accent was mocked, her manners questioned, her role reduced to that of financier-in-chief for the family estate. And yet, for some, the trade-off was worth it. They had tiaras, carriages, and invitations to court. Their names became etched into the genealogies of noble families, ensuring that their children would never again be sneered at as outsiders. The unspoken transaction. Everyone knew the bargain. The nobleman received money. The heiress received a title. The mothers, on both sides, congratulated themselves on successful negotiations. It was a cold logic, one that reduced marriage to a financial transaction. And yet, behind this exchange, lives were profoundly altered. For some women, like Jenny Jerome, the adventure was thrilling. For others, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, it was suffocating. The gilded cage had simply traded one form of confinement for another. Unresolved thought. By 1895, this pattern was firmly established. Castles were propped up by American fortunes, and heiresses traded marble mansions for drafty manors. But what happened after the vows were spoken? How did daily life look for these so-called dollar princesses once the music of the wedding faded? By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the age of the dollar princess was already beginning to evolve. What began as a rigid pattern of arranged matches between American wealth and European titles slowly shifted as the young women themselves began to push back. Some endured, others resisted quietly, and a few broke free altogether, reshaping what it meant to be an heiress. The cracks in the system at first, the marriages seemed unshakable. Contracts were signed, estates restored, and heirs produced, but the cracks were visible from the start. Cultural differences between American brides and their British or French husbands often grew into sources of tension. American women, raised in households where wealth gave them freedom of movement, were often startled by the restrictions of European aristocratic life. A duchess might control a great estate, but she was also bound by traditions, obligations, and social codes that left little room for individuality. The monotony of such lives, endless hosting, adherence to rigid etiquette, and the pressure of preserving appearances became a quiet suffocation for many. Over time, some began to see divorce not as scandal, but as escape. The rise of divorce and separation, the most famous example, remains Consuelo Vanderbilt. After 2 decades of an unhappy marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, she sought separation, and ultimately divorce. When she later married again, this time for love, it symbolized a seismic shift in social expectations. If one of the most famous dollar princesses could reject duty for happiness, perhaps others could too. Divorce was no small act. In Britain, it carried heavy stigma. In America, it could lead to social ostracism. Yet, by the early 20th century, the tide was beginning to turn. Women of wealth, empowered by their independent incomes, could survive without a husband's support. They had options their mothers never imagined. This independence did not always manifest as divorce. Some women negotiated informal separations, living apart from their husbands while maintaining the public facade of marriage. Others stayed in their marriages, but carved out independent spheres, supporting art, funding hospitals, or traveling abroad for extended periods. A new kind of heiresses, the dollar princess generation, matured. Their daughters entered a different world. By the 1910s and 1920s, women were gaining suffrage, higher education was more accessible, and new professions were opening. Heiresses were no longer confined to the marriage market as their sole destiny. Many became patrons of the arts, sponsors of political movements, or even writers and reformers. Some used their wealth to support suffragist campaigns, while others became philanthropists. Their money was no longer simply a dowry for a husband. It could be a tool for personal influence. The heiresses who had endured unhappy marriages often poured their hopes into their children. They wanted their daughters to have choices they themselves had been denied. In this way, the sacrifices of the first wave of dollar princesses seeded a generation of women who were less willing to be bartered. Resistance and quiet rebellion. Not every story is dramatic. For many, resistance took the form of small rebellions, learning to manage their estates independently, refusing to host certain functions, or insisting on privacy from the public eye. These quiet acts chipped away at the suffocating expectations of aristocratic life, even within their marriages. Some women carved out unusual freedoms. Travel became a refuge, with prolonged stays in Paris or New York, allowing them to reconnect with their roots and live apart from their husbands' estates. Others formed circles of American expatriates in London, where shared experiences provided solidarity. The end of an era by the outbreak of the First World War. The age of the dollar princess was already fading. Aristocratic estates faced new economic pressures, and American money was increasingly invested in industries at home rather than in restoring crumbling English castles. The war itself shifted the balance of global power, with America emerging as a financial giant while Europe struggled with recovery. In this new order, the old allure of marrying a titled husband began to lose its shine. Heiresses had less reason to seek validation abroad. Their wealth spoke for itself. The marriages of the earlier generation now looked less like triumphs and more like cautionary tales, reflection, lessons in power and sacrifice. The story of the dollar princesses is not one of simple victimhood or triumph. It is a story of women navigating a narrow path between duty and desire, privilege and prison. Their lives remind us that wealth alone did not guarantee freedom. For some, it created a gilded cage, lined with jewels, but locked all the same. Yet, in breaking free through divorce, independence, or the quiet assertion of agency, these women helped redefine what it meant to be wealthy, female, and powerful at the dawn of the 20th century. Their struggles were deeply personal, but their legacies reshaped expectations for the generations of women who followed. And perhaps the question that remains most relevant is this: were their sacrifices worth the legacies they left behind? Or were they simply the necessary casualties of a society in transition? If the lives of dollar princesses were marked by duty and expectation, then the architects of those marriages, their mothers, were often the true power behind the entire transatlantic exchange. In drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and Newport, the stage was set long before the young women ever set foot in an English country house. The matriarchs of ambition in many ways. The story of dollar princesses is less about the young brides themselves and more about the mothers who arranged their fates. The Gilded Age was dominated by women like Alva Vanderbilt, Mamie Fish, and Carolyn Astor, figures who shaped society in ways that would have been impossible for their husbands. No matter how wealthy, that these mothers saw marriage not only as a social transaction, but as the culmination of their own ambitions. They had clawed their way into respectability in a society still dominated by old money and entrenched social hierarchies. Europe, with its centuries of aristocracy, offered the ultimate prize, a title. If their daughters could not be queens in America, they could at least be duchesses in Britain. Alva Vanderbilt is perhaps the most famous example. Fierce, calculating, and unrelenting, she pushed her daughter Consuelo into marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, despite Consuelo's protests. Diaries and letters reveal the pressure she exerted, emotional, financial, and even physical, for Alva. The match was not just about her daughter's future, but about her own triumph as a social strategist. The daughter's burden for the daughters. However, this parental ambition often meant sacrifice. Raised in lavish homes with every comfort, they were groomed from childhood to be paragons of grace, beauty, and charm. Tutors drilled them in French and piano. Governesses taught them posture and poise. Dance masters rehearsed their every step. For debutante balls, when the time came, they were paraded like jewels before potential suitors, evaluated not for their personalities, but for their dowries. A duchess-in-waiting could expect to bring anywhere from $1 to $5 million into her marriage, an astronomical sum by late 19th century standards. Letters from young heiresses sometimes reveal their confusion. They wondered why their own desires mattered so little, why the marriages were treated as contracts rather than partnerships. Yet social expectation was clear. To refuse such a match was not only a personal rebellion, but a betrayal of family ambition. Martyrs and silent sufferers, some daughters accepted their roles with stoic resignation, embodying what might be called social martyrdom. They understood that their marriages were not for love, but for duty, and they carried themselves accordingly. These women became the pillars of estates, running households, producing heirs, and enduring loveless unions with quiet endurance. Others were less silent. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, eventually broke free of her marriage, divorcing the Duke after decades of unhappiness. Her decision shocked both British and American society, where divorce was still scandalous, but it also marked a turning point. By choosing her own path later in life, she redefined her role from victim to survivor. Manipulators and survivors. Not all women were passive, however. Some learned to manipulate the system in their favor. If they could not escape their marriages, they could at least shape them. Many used their wealth to wield influence, supporting charities, funding hospitals, or even financing their husbands' political careers. Their dowries gave them a kind of soft power that could not be ignored. Jenny Jerome, though from an earlier generation, provides a telling example. She poured her energy into her son, Winston Churchill, ensuring his education and career flourished. In doing so, she redirected the social currency of her marriage into maternal ambition. Other dollar princesses adopted similar strategies, channeling their resources into their children, and through them leaving behind lasting legacies. The cost of maternal ambition, the most haunting element in these stories, is the lingering question of agency. To what extent were these young women victims of their mother's ambitions? Alva Vanderbilt, years later, expressed regret over forcing Consuelo into her marriage, acknowledging that her daughter had suffered for the sake of her own social aspirations. Yet, even in remorse, one sees the paradox of the Gilded Age matriarch. These mothers were powerful women in their own right, operating within the confines of a male-dominated society. They could not run corporations or hold political office, but they could shape dynasties through their daughters. In that sense, their manipulations were both cruel and brilliant, acts of survival as much as ambition. Unfinished reflection. The mothers of the dollar princesses remind us that behind every glittering marriage contract was a woman calculating, maneuvering, and sacrificing in pursuit of a legacy. Their daughters bore the burden of those choices, living lives that oscillated between privilege and prison. But the question lingers. Were these women, both mothers and daughters, complicit architects of a new social order, or were they simply caught in a system that demanded sacrifice for survival? The First World War had shaken the foundations of society, but the 1920s brought a different kind of revolution, one not of battlefields, but of culture, economics, and values. For the American heiresses, who had once been prized for their dowries, the new decade marked the final unraveling of their unique role. No longer did marriage to a duke or count carry the same awe. Instead, prestige came from something new: modernity, celebrity, and the roaring hum of a world eager to forget its scars. The shift in American identity. By the 1920s, the United States was not just wealthy, it was confident. Its factories and banks had underpinned the Allied war effort, and in the aftermath of victory, the nation stood taller on the world stage. In this new world, Americans did not look across the Atlantic with the same mixture of envy and longing that had defined the Gilded Age. Instead, they looked inward, toward skyscrapers rising in New York, jazz clubs in Harlem, and the glamour of Hollywood. Why barter daughters for faded titles when America itself now radiated power and style? The heiresses of the jazz age sought freedom, not coronets. They wore shorter skirts, drove fast cars, and appeared on magazine covers. To be admired in the 1920s, one needed no ancestral estate in Europe. Prestige was found in modern American culture itself. The burden of old estates, meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the very aristocrats who had once benefited from American dollars, were struggling more than ever. The war had deepened financial burdens. British estates faced soaring taxes, declining agricultural revenues, and the practical impossibility of maintaining vast country houses in the old style. The cost of dozens of servants, acres of land, and centuries-old structures was no longer sustainable. Some noble families were forced to sell land, jewels, or even entire homes to survive. Others opened their estates to the public, transforming private halls into museums, hotels, or event spaces. For those married to American heiresses, it was a bitter irony. The money that had once been the lifeline for aristocratic grandeur was now only a temporary patch. The rise of divorce and personal choice, the 1920s, also brought a profound social shift in personal expectations. Marriage was no longer viewed purely as an economic or social contract. Increasingly, it was tied to notions of companionship, love, and individual happiness. The once celebrated unions between American wealth and European nobility now appeared cold and transactional, even cynical. The high-profile divorce of Consuelo Vanderbilt from the Duke of Marlborough confirmed the trend. Newspapers followed the story with fascination, painting Consuelo not as a failed duchess, but as a woman reclaiming her independence. Other dollar princesses followed similar paths. Many sought divorces, separations, or redefined roles within their marriages. A few flourished in their adopted roles, taking on charitable work, political advocacy, or cultural patronage. Yet the central idea that an heiress's duty was to buy her way into aristocracy faded quickly in this new climate of personal freedom. The end of the bargain, perhaps most telling, was the simple fact that wealthy American families stopped offering their daughters to titled Europeans. By the 1920s, the appeal had all but evaporated. Families like the Astors or the Carnegies no longer needed validation from aristocrats. They had enough influence, both social and financial, to command respect without European ties. Their daughters were courted not by dukes and counts, but by financiers, politicians, and artists. The old bargain, American money for European titles, no longer held value for either side. Americans had no need of titles, and titles could no longer guarantee stability. The new aristocracy, money, media, and celebrity in the place of the dollar princesses. Arose a new kind of elite, the celebrities of the Jazz Age and the Industrial, titans of the modern era. Actresses like Clara Bow and Gloria Swanson became icons, admired by millions in ways that actresses of old could never match. American heiresses, too, transformed into celebrities in their own right, not for their marriages, but for their style, daring, and independence. The new aristocracy was no longer defined by inherited land, but by wealth that could generate influence in media, fashion, and politics. Where a Vanderbilt or Gould daughter in 1890 might have been shipped to Europe to save a castle, her granddaughter in 1925 might instead be photographed dancing in Paris, admired not as a duchess but as a modern woman. The quiet dimming of the dollar princess dream. By the close of the 1920s, the dollar princess phenomenon was already history. What had once seemed a grand cultural exchange was now a relic of another world, a world of rigid social hierarchies, glittering but fragile aristocracies, and heiresses willing to sacrifice personal happiness for family ambition. It is telling that no new wave of dollar princesses followed. The marriages that had already taken place lingered on, some enduring, others collapsing. But as the roaring 20s marched toward the turmoil of the Great Depression, it was clear that the grand experiment of exchanging wealth for titles had reached its natural end. Reflection, a pause before the falloned yet. One must wonder, was the decline of the dollar princess era due only to shifting social values and financial burdens, or was it also a symbol of something larger, the fading of old world Europe itself? The 1920s sparkled with energy, but beneath its brilliance lay fragility. The financial crash of 1929 loomed just ahead, promising new challenges for both America's wealthy elite and Europe's struggling aristocracy. Would these coming crises extinguish the last embers of the dollar princess age, or give them one final, fleeting chance to shine? Story 5. The decline of the dollar princess era. War, wealth, and shifting power by the turn of the 20th century. The marriages of American heiresses to European aristocrats had already reshaped both continents. Grand estates were restored, ancient family lines fortified, and the cultural currents of America and Britain grew closer. But just as the dollar princess era seemed at its peak, the world itself was shifting beneath their feet. The early 1900s brought whispers of change that would soon grow into shouts. Industrial power was consolidating empires stretched to their limits, and in 1914 the First World War erupted, an event that would forever alter the social, political, and economic foundations of both Europe and America. For the dollar princesses and the aristocracies they had married into, it marked the beginning of the end. The fragile balance of old and new wealth, late 19th century, had been marked by contrasts. On one side of the Atlantic, the American Gilded Age produced families of immense wealth, Vanderbilts, Astors, Carnegies, and Goulds. Their fortunes grew from steel, oil, shipping, and railroads. creating a class of magnates who lived in opulence unmatched in modern history. On the other side, Europe clung to its old aristocratic traditions. Dukes and duchesses still presided over ancient estates, but the wealth that once sustained their grandeur had been chipped away by generations of division, taxation, and debt. American dollars provided the lifeline, but it was always an uneasy alliance. The arrangement relied on stability. Aristocrats required predictable incomes. Heiresses required security and status. Yet, as the world edged toward war, both sides faced questions of survival that money alone could not answer. The first shockwaves of war when the First World War broke out in 1914. Many of the families formed by these transatlantic marriages suddenly found themselves in precarious positions. For the American brides who had married British or French nobility, the war meant their husbands were often called into military service. Estates were converted into hospitals or billets for soldiers. Social calendars vanished, replaced by the grim realities of rationing and wartime austerity. Those who had married into German aristocracy faced even greater challenges. Some American women found themselves regarded with suspicion in Britain and France, accused of divided loyalties. They were Americans by birth, wives of German nobles by marriage, and now trapped in an atmosphere of hostility. The war was the great leveler. Neither gilded fortune nor ancient title could shield families from loss. Sons of dukes and counts died in trenches beside clerks and farmers. Heiresses, who once worried about gowns and garden parties, now managed food shortages, tended the wounded, or mourned the dead. The end of the illusion of stability. What made the dollar princess era possible was a shared illusion that wealth and title could guarantee permanence. Yet the war revealed how fragile that stability truly was. The landed aristocracy of Britain, already strained, suffered tremendous financial losses as agricultural prices fell and new taxation stripped away incomes. Many estates kept afloat for decades by American money could no longer sustain themselves. In some cases, heiresses' fortunes dwindled to as industries at home restructured under the strain of war production. The concept of marrying for castles and coronets suddenly seemed outdated. The war changed priorities. Security was no longer about prestige, but about survival. In such an atmosphere, the notion of bartering daughters for titles began to feel not only irrelevant, but grotesque. The American perspective back in the United States, attitudes toward these marriages were shifting as well. In the 1870s and 1880s, families had taken pride in marrying into Europe's nobility, seeing it as the ultimate sign of having arrived. But by the early 20th century, America's own power was undeniable. The country was no longer the eager younger sibling of Europe, but an emerging global force. Why should an heiress leave a Fifth Avenue mansion for a crumbling English estate when the prestige of American wealth alone commanded attention across the globe? The narrative of success was changing. Titles seemed increasingly hollow, while fortunes built in American industry, banking, and innovation looked far more promising. Parents who once dreamed of duchesses and countesses for daughters began to prefer respectable American matches. The unraveling of old marriages for those already bound by transatlantic unions. The years of the Great War often marked the beginning of the end. Some marriages dissolved under the strain of separation and hardship. Others endured, but without the former glitter of prestige. The divorce of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough, finalized in 1921 after years of estrangement, became a symbolic bookend to the era. Their union had been celebrated as the pinnacle of the dollar princess phenomenon, and its collapse showed how untenable such arrangements could be in the modern world. The war had revealed that no dowry could guarantee happiness, and no title could insulate a family from upheaval. Reflection, a world on the edge of transformation as the guns fell silent in 1918. The world emerged into a new age. The United States stood taller than ever, its industries strengthened by the demands of war. Europe, meanwhile, staggered under debts, grief, and the loss of an entire generation. For the dollar princesses, the war was both personal and symbolic. It stripped away the illusions of permanence, leaving behind marriages marked by sacrifice, sorrow, or quiet endurance. The gilded dream of uniting American fortunes with European nobility had lost its luster, and yet the question lingered: was this truly the end of the dollar princess era, or merely the beginning of its transformation into something new, less about castles and titles, and more about influence and independence? By the 1930s, the world had changed beyond recognition. From the glittering days when American heiresses sailed across the Atlantic in search of titled husbands, what had once been a phenomenon of prestige and power was now reduced to an echo, remembered mostly in memoirs, gossip columns, and fading portraits in great halls. The twin blows of the Great Depression and the Second World War sealed the fate of both the American heiresses and the European aristocrats who had once relied on them. Together, they marked the final death knell of a world that had glittered for a brief and peculiar half-century. The shock of the Great Depression, the stock market crash of 1929, sent shockwaves through the United States. Families who had once seemed untouchable, the pillars of banking, railroads, and industry, found themselves suddenly vulnerable. Even those who retained wealth did so in a very different social climate. In an America of breadlines and shuttered factories, ostentation was no longer admired. The golden carriages, diamond tiaras, and palatial mansions of the Gilded Age now seemed almost vulgar, even grotesque, to a public struggling to survive. An idea of sending a daughter across the ocean with $1 million dowry to prop up an old European title appeared not just outdated, but tone-deaf. Prestige no longer came from conspicuous alliances, but from quiet resilience and philanthropy. In this climate, the dollar princess was not just irrelevant, she was an anachronism. Europe, in decline of America, faced economic collapse. Europe's crisis was even deeper. Many noble families who had married heiresses in the previous decades found that their fortunes, once stabilized by American wealth, were again slipping away. The great estates that had been shored up with Vanderbilt, Gould, or Astor dollars could not withstand the pressures of falling agricultural revenues, increased taxation, and rising labor costs. The once proud houses of dukes and counts turned into crumbling monuments of a fading order. For some, survival meant selling art collections or jewels. Others abandoned their ancestral homes altogether. And still others, almost symbolically, opened their once exclusive halls to paying visitors, transforming aristocratic privacy into public spectacle. The old aristocracy, once buoyed by American dollars, was now reduced to tourism and nostalgia. The Second World War, a final blow-off. The Depression weakened the last strands tying the heiresses to Europe. The Second World War severed them completely. War swept away the last illusions of aristocratic permanence. Castles were bombed, estates requisitioned, and noble families scattered. Titles themselves, once symbols of stability, lost meaning in the face of global conflict. The survival of nations, not lineages, was at stake. Many American women married into the aristocracy found themselves in precarious positions during the war, running estates while their husbands fought, turning country houses into hospitals, or fleeing advancing armies. Others returned to America altogether, retreating into private lives, far removed from the grand society marriages of their youth. By war's end, the aristocracy remained, but its power had evaporated. Parliament in Britain further curtailed hereditary privilege, taxation grew harsher, and Europe as a whole turned toward reconstruction and democracy. There was no longer a stage on which the dollar princess could shine. The last survivors of a bygone few women endured as living reminders of the phenomenon. Consuelo Vanderbilt, once the most famous dollar princess of all, lived until 1964. Her life, spanning from the peak of the Gilded Age to the dawn of the space race, her memoirs revealed not triumph, but a story of constraint, sacrifice, and eventual escape. Other heiresses, once trapped in loveless marriages, found new roles as patrons of art, philanthropy, or simply as private figures who faded from public view. Some adapted gracefully to the shifting tides, while others clung to the vestiges of grandeur, wearing their titles as shields against the indifference of the modern world. Yet, as individuals, they were not so much admired for their aristocratic connections as for their resilience. The world no longer cared about duchesses and countesses as it once had. The glamour of nobility had been eclipsed by cinema stars, jazz legends, and political leaders who commanded the attention once reserved for titled families. Legacy and reflection. Looking back, the era of the dollar princesses appears almost like a fairy tale, glittering, improbable, and tinged with melancholy. They were symbols of a specific moment in history, born from a collision of two societies, an America bursting with new money and ambition, and a Europe weighed down by old hierarchies and debt. For a time, they bridged the Atlantic, stitching together fortunes and titles in marriages that seemed, on paper, mutually beneficial. But time revealed the cost. Many of these women lived lives of constraint, alienation, and loneliness. Their wealth propped up crumbling estates, but often at the expense of their personal happiness. Some escaped, others endured, and a few flourished, but as a phenomenon. Their existence was never sustainable. By the mid-20th century, the world had moved on. Marriage for money or title seemed almost quaint in a world increasingly defined by independence, modern careers, and new kinds of fame. What had once been the pinnacle of ambition, to become a duchess or a countess, was now simply another relic of a vanished age. The final curtain, the dollar princesses, in the end, were both dream and tragedy. A dream of glamour and social ascent, a tragedy of duty and personal sacrifice. They remind us that history is often shaped by bargains between wealth and prestige, tradition and ambition, appearance and reality. Their world was not built to last. It glittered for a moment, then faded, leaving only echoes in grand houses, yellowing newspapers, and whispered family histories. And so the story closes, a peculiar, fascinating chapter in the long saga of both America and Europe, where money and titles met on the marriage altar, and where, in time, both lost their luster. If the lives of dollar princesses were marked by duty and expectation, then the architects of those marriages, their mothers, were often the true power behind the entire transatlantic exchange. In drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and Newport, the stage was set long before the young women ever set foot in an English country house. The matriarchs of ambition, in many ways, the story of dollar princesses is less about the young brides themselves and more about the mothers who arranged their fates. The Gilded Age was dominated by women like Alva Vanderbilt, Mamie Fish, and Caroline Astor, figures who shaped society in ways that would have been impossible for their husbands. No matter how wealthy, these mothers saw marriage not only as a social transaction but as the culmination of their own ambitions. They had clawed their way into respectability in a society still dominated by old money and entrenched social hierarchies. Europe, with its centuries of aristocracy, offered the ultimate prize, a title. If their daughters could not be queens in America, they could at least be duchesses in Britain. Alva Vanderbilt is perhaps the most famous example. Fierce, calculating, and unrelenting, she pushed her daughter Consuelo into marriage with the Duke of Marlborough. Despite Consuelo's protests, diaries and letters reveal the pressure she exerted, emotional, financial, and even physical. For Alva, the match was not just about her daughter's future, but about her own triumph as a social strategist. The daughter's burden for the daughters. However, this parental ambition often meant sacrifice. Raised in lavish homes with every comfort, they were groomed from childhood to be paragons of grace, beauty, and charm. Tutors drilled them in French and piano. Governesses taught them posture and poise. Dance masters rehearsed their every step for debutante balls. When the time came, they were paraded like jewels before potential suitors, evaluated not for their personalities, but for their dowries. A duchess-in-waiting could expect to bring anywhere from $1 to $5 million into her marriage, an astronomical sum by late 19th century standards. Letters from young heiresses sometimes reveal their confusion. They wondered why their own desires mattered so little, why the marriages were treated as contracts rather than partnerships. Yet social expectation was clear. To refuse such a match was not only a personal rebellion, but a betrayal of family ambition. Martyrs and silent sufferers, some daughters accepted their roles with stoic resignation, embodying what might be called social martyrdom. They understood that their marriages were not for love but for duty, and they carried themselves accordingly. These women became the pillars of estates, running households, producing heirs, and enduring loveless unions with quiet endurance. Others were less silent. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, eventually broke free of her marriage, divorcing the Duke after decades of unhappiness. Her decision shocked both British and American society, where divorce was still scandalous, but it also marked a turning point. By choosing her own path later in life. She redefined her role from victim to survivor. Manipulators and survivors. Not all women were passive, however. Some learned to manipulate the system in their favor. If they could not escape their marriages, they could at least shape them. Many used their wealth to wield influence, supporting charities, funding hospitals, or even financing their husbands' political careers. Their dowries gave them a kind of soft power that could not be ignored. Jenny Jerome, though from an earlier generation, provides a telling example. She poured her energy into her son, Winston Churchill, ensuring his education and career flourished. In doing so, she redirected the social currency of her marriage into maternal ambition. Other dollar princesses adopted similar strategies, channeling their resources into their children, and through them, leaving behind lasting legacies. The cost of maternal ambition. The most haunting element in these stories is the lingering question of agency. To what extent were these young women victims of their mother's ambitions? Alva Vanderbilt, years later, expressed regret over forcing Consuelo into her marriage, acknowledging that her daughter had suffered for the sake of her own social aspirations. Yet, even in remorse, one sees the paradox of the Gilded Age matriarch. These mothers were powerful women in their own right, operating within the confines of a male-dominated society. They could not run corporations or hold political office, but they could shape dynasties through their daughters. In that sense, their manipulations were both cruel and brilliant acts of survival, as much as ambition. Unfinished reflection. Mothers of the dollar princesses remind us that behind every glittering marriage contract was a woman calculating, maneuvering, and sacrificing in pursuit of a legacy. Their daughters bore the burden of those choices, living lives that oscillated between privilege and prison. But the question lingers. Were these women both mothers and daughters, complicit architects of a new social order, or were they simply caught in a system that demanded sacrifice for survival? By 1895, the idea of the American heiress marrying into European aristocracy was no longer novel. It was an established, if quietly acknowledged, tradition. Yet behind the polished image of a young woman in silks, standing at the altar beside a duke or earl, there was an entire machinery of planning, networking, and negotiation. These marriages did not happen by accident. They were constructed, piece by determined mothers, social strategists, and even the press itself. To understand the life of a dollar princess, one must step into this machinery and see how such unions were made possible. The mothers generals of the marriage marketat, the heart of nearly every transatlantic marriage, was a mother with unshakable ambition. For these women, arranging their daughters' futures was not simply a matter of preference, but of strategy, pride, and in some cases, vengeance against a society that had once excluded them. Take Alva Vanderbilt, one of the most famous examples. In New York, she had spent years battling to be accepted by the Astors and the entrenched old money elite. When she realized that American society would never fully recognize her as its queen, she turned her attention to Europe. If she could not dominate Fifth Avenue, then she would conquer Mayfair. Her daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, became her weapon. Alva orchestrated Consuelo's marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough with precision. She studied the Duke's financial troubles, understood his desperation for an heiress's dowry, and positioned her daughter accordingly. The match was finalized in 1895, with a dowry rumored to be over $2 million, a staggering sum. equivalent to tens of millions today. For Alva and mothers like her, these marriages were campaigns. They maneuvered their daughters through balls, teas, and social calls with military discipline, ensuring that the right people noticed them, that conversations were steered toward titles, and that no opportunity for an introduction was missed. The London season, a stage for heiresses' London society in the late 19th century, functioned like a theater. Each spring, aristocratic families returned from their country estates and filled the city's mansions, eager for the endless round of social events that constituted the season. For American families, this was the battlefield. Invitations were essential, and securing them often required clever negotiation. Wealthy Americans would rent or purchase London townhouses, hire British staff, and even import carriages to ensure their daughters appeared suitably refined. The daughters were then paraded at balls, tea parties, and opera nights, their dresses imported from Paris, their manners carefully coached, every movement from the tilt of a head to the way they carried a fan was scrutinized. One false step could brand them as gauche and undo months of preparation. But when done correctly, the effect could be dazzling. An heiress might walk into a ballroom and instantly become the center of attention, her dowry whispered about in corners, her beauty noted in society columns, her mother smiling triumphantly from the edge of the room. The role of the newspapers, the rise of the dollar princess, was not just a private affair. It was a public spectacle. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic eagerly reported on every engagement, every wedding, and every scandal. The New York Times might publish detailed descriptions of a heiress's trousseau, listing the gowns, jewels, and linens that would accompany her overseas. London papers, meanwhile, speculated openly about which titled gentleman was in need of a wealthy wife. The press turned these marriages into stories of fascination and envy. American readers thrilled at the idea of their girls becoming duchesses, while British readers grumbled about Yankee dollars invading their nobility. This attention only heightened the stakes. A failed match was not just a personal disappointment. It could be a public embarrassment. The negotiations, dowries, and debt behind, the glittering dances and polite conversation. The true heart of these marriages lay in negotiation. A titled suitor did not simply woo an heiress. His family and lawyers negotiated directly with her parents. The discussions were blunt. How large was the dowry? How would it be paid? Would there be annual allowances? What financial guarantees could be offered? Sometimes the sums were immense. Consuelo Vanderbilt's $2 million dowry was not an exception, but part of a broader trend. Heiresses frequently brought fortunes that could rescue entire estates from collapse. In exchange, they received a title, social prestige, and a new role. In one of Europe's most famous families, it was, in every sense, a contract, a blending of bank ledgers and bloodlines. The heiresses themselves lost, amid the ambition of mothers and the desperation of noble families, were the young women themselves. Some were dazzled by the idea of castles, tiaras, and European glamour. Others dreaded the prospect, preferring the familiarity of America. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, wept through her wedding day, forced into a marriage she did not want. Yet others, like Jenny Jerome, embraced their roles with energy and charisma, shaping political and social circles in ways that even their husbands could not. For every heiress, the experience was unique, but few escaped the sense that they had been placed on a stage, their lives scripted by forces beyond their control. The broader impact, a new social order, the rise of the dollar princesses, reshaped both American and European society. In America, they elevated their family status, transforming fortunes into legitimacy. In Britain, they injected new wealth into old names, preserving aristocratic traditions for another generation. But the impact was also more subtle. These women brought American perspectives into the heart of European nobility. They were often more outspoken, more independent, and less bound by tradition than their British counterparts. Over time, they influenced not just family finances, but also social attitudes, from philanthropy to the role of women in public life. Unresolved thought so. The machinery of matchmaking turned on year after year, producing new unions that bound together fortunes and titles. But for the young women who crossed the Atlantic, what was daily life truly like once the contracts were signed and the dowries paid? Beyond the glitter of weddings and the grandeur of castles, what rhythms, obligations, and quiet struggles filled their days as newly minted duchesses and countesses. Story 2. A New Life Across the Atlantic. If you were a dollar princess in 1895, leaving behind your marble mansion in Newport or your townhouse on Fifth Avenue, your next step would not be to step directly into an English castle. First came the journey. And the journey meant the Atlantic Ocean, a voyage of nearly 3,000 miles, a passage that separated the glitter of the Gilded Age from the stiff traditions of the British aristocracy. Unlike earlier centuries, by the 1890s, the crossing was no longer an ordeal of cramped cabins and dangerous storms, though danger always lurked at sea. Instead, the great shipping lines, Cunard White Star and Hamburg America, competed to transform ocean travel into a floating world of luxury. To board one of their great liners in New York Harbor was to enter a new society, one that mirrored the very class distinctions that the heiress was leaving behind on land. The great liners, floating palaces of the Atlantic. By 1895, the great ocean liners had become symbols of modern engineering and opulence. Ships like the RMS Campania and RMS Lucania of the Cunard Line were technological marvels. Powered by massive steam engines, they could cross the Atlantic in less than 6 days, a speed unimaginable only a generation earlier. But more than speed, it was comfort and spectacle that mattered to the passengers who would one day be dollar princesses. With brass fixtures, feather beds, and electric lights, they resembled elegant hotel suites. Some had private sitting rooms, velvet curtains discreetly in the background, promenade decks, long stretches of polished wood where passengers strolled in the sea air, careful to maintain appearances, smoking rooms and lounges, spaces reserved for men to play cards, drink brandy, and exchange gossip about politics and finance. Every detail reinforced the distinctions of class. For the young heiress, her passage would be in first class, and occasionally titled Europeans returning from a visit to the New World. Life on board, the rhythm of the crossing despite the luxury. Life on board followed a monotonous rhythm. The sea might be vast, but the daily routine of a first-class passenger was carefully structured. Morning, breakfast in the dining saloon, often at a set hour. Afterwards, a walk on deck or reading in the lounge, while stewards polished brass. railings and scrubbed the decks. Afternoon luncheon, followed by deck games like shuffleboard, quoits, or even a turn at the ship's gymnasium, a novelty on some liners. Ladies might embroider or read novels in the ladies' drawing room, while gentlemen smoked and discussed stocks or horse racing. Evening. The great event of the day was dinner, a multi-course meal of French soups, roasts, and delicate pastries, followed by music. After dinner, the first-class passengers might dance or retire to card games that stretched past midnight. It was, in many ways, a repetition of life in Newport or New York, and yet the sea imposed its own order. Rough weather could confine passengers to their cabins, while foghorns and the constant hum of engines reminded everyone of the uncertainty beneath the luxury. The social theater of the voyage for a dollar princess. The voyage was not just travel, it was another stage of display. Fellow passengers were carefully observed. The ship itself became a microcosm of society, where appearances mattered as much as on land. An heiress might appear in the latest Paris fashions at promenade, her gowns tailored to withstand the sea breezes. Her mother, watchful as ever, might strike up conversations with titled gentlemen or British matrons, laying the groundwork for introductions in London. In this sense, the Atlantic was not just an ocean, it was a bridge of strategy, where reputations were built or spoiled before one even set foot on English soil. Below deck, the contrast of second and steerage, while the first-class passengers dined on oysters and champagne, life was far different below deck, second class. Comfortable but modest, often occupied by merchants, teachers, or middle-class families traveling abroad. Their cabins were smaller, their meals simpler, their entertainment more limited. Steerage, crowded, noisy, and plain. Steerage was the realm of immigrants, men, women, and children, packed into dormitory-style bunks. They cooked simple meals, endured seasickness, and dreamed of new lives in America, or, for some, a return to Europe. For the heiress, the contrast was stark. Above, chandeliers and velvet. Below, bare metal bunks and the smell of boiled potatoes. This reminder of social divide underscored the very reason her voyage existed at all: to exchange American dollars for European titles, to bridge two worlds separated not only by an ocean but by class itself. The arrival rituals. The liner steamed toward England. Anticipation built. First-class passengers, including our imagined heiress, prepared their trunks, their gowns, and their nerves. Disembarkation was not a simple matter of stepping ashore. From the very moment of arrival, the machinery of expectation began to turn. The heiress, still half-dazed from the crossing, now faced her true challenge, entering a world where centuries of tradition shaped every glance, every word, every gesture, unresolved. Thought the Atlantic voyage was a threshold, a time of waiting, of performance, of anticipation. But what awaited on the far shore was more daunting than any storm at sea. How would an American heiress adjust to the rigid codes of English aristocracy? What did it mean to step from the freedom of America into the etiquette-bound world of dukes, duchesses, and drawing rooms? Imagine stepping off the great ocean liner in 1895, the salt spray still clinging to your dress, the sound of stevedores shouting as they unloaded luggage, and the weight of expectation pressing down with every breath. You are no longer in America, where wealth and novelty dazzled society. You are in England, a land of centuries-old titles, rigid hierarchies, and traditions that govern every detail of life. From how you greet a stranger to where you may sit at dinner. For $1, princess. This was the true crossing, not of the ocean, but of cultures. The shift was profound, and for many, it was overwhelming. First impressions: England's reserved grandeur, compared with the bustle of New York or the glitter of Newport. England in 1895 struck many Americans as both majestic and restrained. The great cities of London and Oxford exuded history, their streets winding around medieval churches, Georgian terraces, and Tudor houses. Country estates sprawled across green fields, their driveways lined with ancient oaks. Yet, for all their beauty, there was a stiffness in the air. Where Americans laughed loudly and embraced novelty, the English elite valued restraint, understatement, and a formality that bordered on ceremony. To speak too freely, to laugh too loudly, or to boast of one's wealth was to mark oneself. Immediately, as an outsider, the American heiress quickly learned that her accent set her apart. Her boldness, admired at home, was often read as brashness. In London, even the way she held her fork could betray her origins. Every detail mattered, and every detail was judged. The code of etiquette to survive in England's aristocracy. One had to master an intricate code of etiquette, a system as binding as law, enforced not by police but by the cold glances of hostesses and the whispers of gossips. Some of the rules included introductions. A young woman could not speak to a man unless introduced by a mutual acquaintance. Improper introductions were scandalous. Calling cards, visits were managed through calling cards. Small printed slips left at the homes of acquaintances. To fail to return a call was a grave insult. Dress codes, morning, afternoon, and evening, required entirely different wardrobes. A misstep, such as wearing jewels in the morning, could ruin a reputation. Conversation, topics such as money, business, or personal achievement were considered vulgar. Wit was prized, but it had to be delivered with a light touch. Hierarchy at dinners. Seating was arranged with mathematical precision, according to rank and title. A duchess sat above a countess, no matter her age or wealth. For $1 princess, accustomed to the relatively freer manners of New York. These rules could feel like a suffocating net. Every social encounter was a test, and failure carried lasting consequences. The country house, as a stage of London, was the arena of public display. The true heart of aristocratic life lay in the country house. A visit to a duke's or earl's estate was both an honor and a trial. Imagine arriving by carriage, the gravel crunching under the wheels, as liveried footmen opened the great oak doors. Inside, the house was grand, but often drafty, with long corridors hung with portraits of ancestors dating back centuries. You might be shown to a bedroom where the wallpaper was faded, the fireplace smoked, and the water for washing was lukewarm during the day. The rhythms of life were dictated by tradition, hunting, riding, and long walks in the garden. In the evening, dinners stretched for hours, each course accompanied by carefully choreographed conversation. A young heiress was expected to listen more than speak, to flatter without seeming insincere, and to appear endlessly composed. To misstep was to be remembered and not kindly. The English aristocracy had long memories, and a single faux pas could haunt a woman for seasons to come, the chaperone and the watchful eye-like in America, where young women were increasingly allowed a measure of independence. English society kept heiresses under strict supervision. Chaperones, often older relatives or trusted family friends, ensured that no interaction with men occurred without oversight. Even married women were not entirely free. A duchess might command her household, but she was still bound by expectations to host, to manage, to obey the unspoken rules that dictated every aspect of noble life. This surveillance was suffocating to some Americans. They had grown up in households where mothers plotted their futures, but once married, they had often imagined greater freedom. Instead, they found themselves under a new and equally relentless gaze, that of the British aristocracy itself. The shock of status for the American heiress. One of the hardest lessons was that money did not erase hierarchy. In America, a Vanderbilt or an Astor could dominate a room by sheer wealth. In Britain, a duchess or countess outranked them, regardless of fortune. A woman who had grown up believing her family to be the pinnacle of society might suddenly find herself looked down upon by ladies whose families were older but far poorer. This inversion was disorienting. It made the heiress feel both indispensable for her money and invisible for her lack of pedigree. She was both honored and snubbed, celebrated and mocked. The strain of assimilation adjusting to this world was no easy task. Some young women threw themselves into the challenge, hiring tutors to polish their accents, studying etiquette manuals, and mimicking their English peers. Others resisted, clinging to their American identity, even if it cost them social standing. For many, the strain was emotional. Letters written by dollar princesses often reveal a deep sense of isolation, homesickness for America, loneliness in drafty halls, and frustration with rigid customs. They had crossed the ocean expecting fairy tales, only to find themselves in what one heiress called a gilded prison, unresolved, thoughtened. Yet this was only the beginning. For once the American heiress adjusted to England's codes and expectations, a new challenge awaited her. Not the drawing room, but the household. How was she to manage the endless responsibilities of running an estate, commanding servants, and maintaining appearances while hiding her own doubts and desires? By now, the young American heiress has survived her arrival, endured the stiff expectations of English society, and begun to grasp the relentless codes of etiquette. But as the weeks of her new life stretch into months, another reality dawns. Marriage to a nobleman was not simply about glittering dinners and drawing-room performances. It was about duty, unyielding, daily, and often exhausting duty. For many of the dollar princesses, the glamour of aristocratic titles lay a truth few Americans understood before they arrived. The great country estates of England were not merely symbols of prestige. They were financial burdens. Vast manors with dozens of bedrooms, sweeping lawns, and miles of farmland demanded endless upkeep. To heat thousands of acres of tenant farmland needed management. Villages attached to the estate required schools, churches. The heiress's fortune was not for jewels and gowns alone. It was the lifeblood that kept the estate afloat, the replacement of tenant roofs and the salaries of gamekeepers. The role of the aristocratic wifeit was not enough to pay. The wife was expected to manage. Running a great house was akin to running a business. The lady of the estate was the chief executive, though one bound by centuries of tradition. She oversaw dozens of servants, butlers, housemaids, footmen, gardeners, cooks, governesses, nannies, laundresses, and stable boys. Each had a strict rank and role. Or repairs. There might be letters from tenant farmers requesting aid after a poor harvest, or a meeting with the local vicar about funding the parish school. A wife was expected to manage all of this with grace, never showing fatigue and never revealing that her fortune was stretched thin. In America, wealth had freed women from the grind of domestic labor. In England, wealth bound them to it. The strain of servant life to an American heiress, the servant system was a revelation. Might have over 100. Each servant knew their place in a hierarchy as rigid as that of the aristocracy itself. But for the mistress, the complexity could be overwhelming. She had to remember names, settle disputes, balance wages, and manage discipline. Servants expected her attention, yet judged her as foreign. A misplaced order, a tone too sharp, or an unfamiliarity with English customs could provoke resentment. Letters and diaries of the time record the exhaustion this created. One heiress wrote of the burden of constant surveillance, noting that the eyes of one's servants weigh more than the gaze of a ballroom. Loneliness in grandeur. The physical grandeur of country houses often masked personal isolation. Imagine winter evenings in drafty drawing rooms, the wind rattling the windows, while your husband spent long hours in the smoking room with his friends. Homesickness often grew sharper in these moments. Letters from mothers and sisters in America reminded the heiress of bustling Newport summers, of friends who laughed more freely, of a life that had been hers but was now irretrievable. Some sought comfort in books, others in charitable work, and a few in carefully chosen friendships. But many described their early years as lonely, a solitude gilded with duty. Children and continuity, another duty loomed over all others, the production of heirs. Aristocratic marriages were about dynasties, and the American heiress was expected to provide sons to carry forward the family name. Childbirth in the 1890s remained dangerous. Women were often blamed for miscarriages or stillbirths, even when medicine could do little to prevent them. A wife who failed to provide an heir was pitied at best, scorned at worst. This expectation added another layer of strain as young women, barely out of girlhood, found themselves thrust into motherhood under constant scrutiny, finding a new identity and, yet, for some, the role became an opportunity. They used their fortunes to modernize estates, introducing electricity, plumbing, and new agricultural methods. They sponsored schools, hospitals, and charities, leaving a tangible mark on the communities. They now ruled. A few dollar princesses even grew to love their adopted land, embracing the traditions that had once suffocated them. With patience, they transformed from outsiders into the very symbols of English aristocracy. American for England, too anglicized for America. Their lives an endless negotiation between belonging and exile, unresolved reflection and so. The American heiress in 1895 found herself at a crossroads. Would she bend to the weight of tradition, carving out a place within the rigid walls of English society? Was one that every dollar princess faced, and it was only the beginning, for beyond the manor walls, the very world into which she had married. Story 3. The Politics of Marriage. American Money and the survival of the British aristocracy. When you picture the grand estates of Britain in the late 19th century, the image may be one of timeless stability. Stone manors surrounded by green fields, ancient titles carried proudly by families whose lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest. Yet by the 1870s and 1880s, this vision was becoming a fragile illusion. Behind the gilded facades of the aristocracy lay a financial crisis that threatened the very survival of Britain's ancient families. It is here, in this slow decline, that the story of the so-called dollar princesses begins to make historical sense. The cost of grandeur for centuries. The British aristocracy had been the wealthiest ruling class in the world, deriving their income not from industry or trade, but from land. Their estates stretched across counties, producing rents from tenant farmers and profits from agricultural goods. But by the mid-19th century, the foundations of this wealth had begun to crack. Agricultural prices collapsed as cheaper grain from America and Eastern Europe flooded into Britain, transported swiftly by railways and steamships. British farmers could not compete. Tenants struggled to pay rents, and many simply abandoned their leases. The great landowners, dukes, marquises, and earls suddenly found themselves with vast acres that yielded little profit at the same time. The costs of maintaining aristocratic life were rising. A country estate required constant repair. A London townhouse was expected for the season. Servants had to be paid. Balls had to be thrown. Nobility demanded not only wealth, but display, and the expense of keeping up appearances became overwhelming. The result was simple. Many noble families were rich in land, but poor in money. The American contrast across the Atlantic. The picture could not have been more different. In the wake of the Gilded Age, America was overflowing with newly made fortunes. Railroads, steel, oil, and banking had created an industrial aristocracy of their own. Men like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Gould. Their wives and daughters lived amid opulence unimaginable to most Europeans. Marble mansions in Newport, Fifth Avenue townhouses, and summer houses staffed by dozens of servants. But money, however vast, lacked the one thing America could not create on its own: ancient titles. In a nation that prided itself on democracy, social climbing still existed, and the allure of aristocracy proved irresistible. What good was a ballroom lined with mirrors if one's family name was only a generation old? And so, the equation became clear. British families needed dollars to maintain their estates. American families desired titles to cement their social standing. Marriage became the natural solution. The first unions by the 1870s. Newspapers began to report with fascination on Anglo-American marriages. One of the earliest and most famous was that of Jenny Jerome, the daughter of a New York financier, who in 1874 married Lord Randolph Churchill. The match was whispered about across drawing rooms, and though Randolph had little money, he had one of the oldest family names in Britain. Their son, Winston Churchill, would later become one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. Stories like these spread rapidly. Two ambitious American mothers. England seemed to offer a glittering opportunity. Two detraden lords. America offered salvation in the form of bank accounts and dowries. The phenomenon soon earned its nickname, the era of the dollar princesses. The social machinery of marriage These unions were not accidents of love. They were arranged with the precision of diplomacy. Introductions were made during London's season, when families of rank and fortune mingled at balls, dinners, and country weekends. Wealthy Americans rented houses in Grosvenor Square, hired carriages with crests, and adopted the correct etiquette to make themselves visible. Behind the scenes, mothers acted as strategists. From sympathetic duchesses who had already made similar matches, dowries were discussed in private, often in shocking detail. In one case, an English duke received over $1 million, equivalent to tens of millions today, as the price of his union. Yet, it was not merely a cold transaction. The press delighted in describing these young American women as energetic, lively, and unafraid to speak their minds. They brought a freshness that sometimes charmed and sometimes scandalized. The more restrained English drawing rooms, the aristocratic perspective for the noble families. The marriages represented both relief and humiliation. On the one hand, they allowed crumbling estates to be restored, debts to be paid, and traditions to continue. On the other, they revealed the weakness of a class once thought invincible. Letters from the period show a mix of gratitude and condescension. Some lords referred to their American wives as saviors, while others derided them as vulgar. The contradictions were stark. To survive, the aristocracy had to embrace the very people it had once dismissed as uncultured colonials. The American perspective for the Americans. The appeal was equally complex. To marry into nobility was to escape the sneering whispers of new money back home. A title elevated not just the woman, but her entire family, granting them a place in history books and heraldic rolls. But the transition came at a cost. A duchess's life was bound by duty, etiquette, and expectations unfamiliar to girls raised in the more relaxed freedom of America. Still, the allure proved irresistible. By the 1890s, the wave of marriages had become so prominent that satirical cartoons filled newspapers, depicting dollars flowing across the Atlantic in exchange for the cultural exchange, half financial, half social, reshaped both nations. Unresolved reflection and, so, as the 19th century drew toward its end, the stage was set for one of the most unusual social bargains in modern history, clung to survival through American fortunes. While ambitious heiresses stepped into roles that both dazzled and trapped them. But what did this exchange truly mean? Were these marriages simply transactions of convenience? Or did they represent something deeper about the transformation of society at the dawn of the modern age? By the 1890s, the phenomenon of the dollar princess was no longer an isolated curiosity. It had become a full-fledged social trend, spoken of across salons in London, country estates in Yorkshire, and drawing rooms in New York. Entire books were written about the marriages, and satirical cartoons lampooned both the British lords desperate for money and the Americans desperate for status. This was not just a few families exchanging fortunes and titles. It was a cultural shift. The era produced marriages so dazzling, so scandalous, and so significant that they altered the very fabric of Anglo-American relations. The scale of the marriages historians estimate that between 1870 and 1910, more than 350 American heiresses married into the British aristocracy. Their combined dowries amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars, billions in today's terms. The names read like a roll call of the most prominent families on both sides of the Atlantic. Vanderbilts, Astors, and Goulds merged with dukes of Marlborough, earls of Granard, and marquises of Anglesey. These unions were not confined to Britain. French aristocrats, Italian princes, and German counts also sought out American wives. But the English marriages were the most visible and the most influential. The Vanderbilts and the Dukedom of Marlborough, perhaps the most famous and most scrutinized of all these marriages, was that of Consuelo Vanderbilt to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in 1895. Consuelo was the daughter of Alva Vanderbilt, one of the most formidable social figures in America. Alva had fought tirelessly to break into New York's elite society, famously throwing a lavish ball in her marble mansion to force the Astors into acknowledging her family. But Alva wanted more than just New York recognition. She wanted a title for her daughter. The Duke of Marlborough, meanwhile, was in financial ruin. His ancestral seat, Blenheim Palace, was crumbling. Repairs and upkeep required enormous sums of money that his estate simply could not provide. The solution was clear. He needed dollars. Consuelo brought with her a dowry of around $2.5 million, an astonishing figure at the time. In return, she became the Duchess of Marlborough. Newspapers across both countries described the match in glowing detail, while also whispering about its cold-blooded arrangement. The reality was less romantic. Consuelo had been forced into the marriage by her mother, who saw it as her duty to secure the family's legacy. Consuelo herself wept as she walked down the aisle, her heart belonging to another man. Years later, she admitted that her wedding felt like a sale, not a union. And yet, Blenheim Palace was saved. The Vanderbilt millions restored its grandeur, ensuring its survival into the modern age. Public fascination and scorn the spectacle of these marriages captivated the press. Papers printed endless columns about gowns, jewels, and dowries. American readers thrilled to see their compatriots entering the world of dukes and duchesses. British readers, meanwhile, alternated between fascination and disdain. Cartoons mocked the exchange of gold for coronets, showing portly dukes leading heiresses to the altar, while dollar bills fluttered in the background. Critics sneered at the invasion of American women, claiming they brought vulgarity and ostentation into the sober traditions of the aristocracy. Yet, the same critics could not ignore the obvious truth. Without American fortunes, many great houses would have collapsed. The marriages kept estates intact, preserved collections of art, and maintained centuries-old traditions. The heiresses, experiences behind the headlines, lay the personal realities of these women, which were often far from the fairy tale's promised life. As a duchess or countess was not merely about wearing tiaras and attending balls. It meant managing vast estates, overseeing servants, and navigating a complex web of social obligations. For American women used to greater independence, the restrictions could feel suffocating. Consuelo Vanderbilt described her marriage as prison-like, recounting how her husband treated her coldly and how the weight of tradition crushed her spirit. Others, like Mary Leiter, who became Lady Curzon after marrying Lord Curzon, the future Viceroy of India, adapted with remarkable success, winning admiration and exercising real influence in politics and philanthropy. Some heiresses thrived, reshaping their roles with energy and determination. They used their fortunes to support charities, fund hospitals, and improve the lives of tenants on their estates. Others lived in quiet misery, trapped in loveless marriages and alienated from their American families. The question of national identity. These marriages also raised questions about cultural identity. Was an American woman who became a duchess still truly American, or had she surrendered herself to the old world? Some critics argued that the phenomenon represented a form of cultural submission, where America's democratic ideals were traded for the trappings of aristocracy. But others saw it differently. They argued that the marriages were not a loss, but a kind of triumph, proof that the upstart Americans now had the wealth to prop up Europe's most ancient families. In this sense, the heiresses symbolized the shift of global power from Europe to America, long before politics and wars would make the transition undeniable. The dollar princess as a cultural icon by the turn of the century. The dollar princess had become a cultural archetype. She appeared in novels, plays, and gossip columns. Henry James wrote about the clash between American girls and European aristocracy, capturing both the humor and tragedy of the encounters. Edith Wharton explored similar themes, dissecting the ambitions of mothers and the sacrifices of daughters. The idea of a young woman crossing the Atlantic with steamer trunks filled with gowns, stepping into a drafty English castle, and finding herself both admired and resented. It fascinated audiences on both continents. Unresolved reflection. The marriages of the 1890s represented the peak of the dollar princess phenomenon, dazzling in scale, rich in money, and heavy with consequence. Yet, behind the glittering headlines lay deeper questions. Were these women heroines, sacrificing themselves to preserve great houses and family legacies? Or were they pawns, traded in a transatlantic game of wealth and survival? And perhaps more. Importantly, what would happen when the tide inevitably turned, when America's fortunes grew even greater, and Britain's aristocracy slipped further into decline? By the early years of the 20th century, the grand experiment of the dollar princess was showing cracks. What had once been hailed as the salvation of the aristocracy now began to look fragile, unsustainable, and even tragic. For many of the women involved, their gilded marriages brought neither lasting happiness nor enduring security. Instead, they found themselves caught between two collapsing worlds, an aristocracy bound 2 centuries of tradition and an America charging forward into modernity. The strains of aristocratic life when the first wave of marriages occurred in the 1870s and 1880s. The union of dollars and titles seemed mutually beneficial. By the 1910s, however, the arrangement was faltering. British aristocratic life was demanding in ways few Americans fully understood before their vows. The upkeep of massive estates required constant attention, and the social season was a relentless cycle of obligations. Heiresses, who had once been admired for their energy and independence, found themselves suffocated by ritual. Consuelo Vanderbilt's letters and memoirs provide one of the most vivid testimonies. Her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, though celebrated in newspapers, became a personal torment. She described her husband as distant, cold, and controlling. Blenheim Palace, though magnificent, felt like a prison. Over time, she withdrew from public life, focusing instead on her children and charitable work. Many other dollar princesses shared similar experiences: isolation, cultural clashes, and the nagging realization that their immense dowries had not purchased affection. The era of divorces, the 20th century, dawned. Divorce became an increasingly common, though still scandalous, solution. Several high-profile dollar princess marriages collapsed. Consuelo Vanderbilt, after nearly 2 decades of unhappiness, divorced the Duke of Marlborough in 1921. She later remarried Jacques Balsan, a French aviator, and found a measure of personal freedom that had eluded her as a duchess. Other heiresses followed a similar path. The marriages that had been hailed as fairy tales in the press often ended in bitter separations, proving that money and titles alone could not sustain companionship. The divorce scandals further eroded the glamour of the phenomenon, exposing its transactional nature to public ridicule. The shadow of World War I accelerated the decline of the dollar princess era. The war devastated the European aristocracy, not only in lives lost, but in financial ruin. Estates that had been preserved through American dowries were now drained by wartime expenses, new taxes, and the collapse of agricultural incomes. For American women married into this world, the experience was often harrowing. Many devoted themselves to war work, running hospitals, organizing relief, or transforming their estates into convalescent homes. Some gained admiration for their service, proving themselves more than just wealthy interlopers. But the devastation of war made clear that no amount of American money could permanently stave off the decline of the old order. By the 1920s, the tide had turned decisively. The aristocracy could no longer rely on heiresses to save them, and Americans no longer saw titles as the ultimate prize. The Gilded Age ambition of marrying into Europe's nobility gave way to new ideals: business, philanthropy, and the pursuit of modern glamour in Hollywood and beyond. A complex legacy, the legacy of the dollar princesses, is both glittering and somber. They preserved palaces and great houses, leaving behind architectural treasures that might otherwise have crumbled. They brought fresh energy and, in some cases, new ideas into aristocratic society. Their marriages created bonds between America and Europe that endured in unexpected ways. Winston Churchill himself was the son of a dollar princess, Jenny Jerome. But their personal stories reveal the costs of these arrangements. Many women sacrificed love and happiness for duty, coerced by mothers eager for status or fathers seeking respectability. The marriages highlight the limitations placed on women in both societies, celebrated for their wealth but rarely valued for their individuality. From heiresses to icons in the decades that followed, the dollar princesses became subjects of novels, plays, and films. Their lives, with all their glamour and heartbreak, embodied the contradictions of the Gilded Age. They were both admired and pitied, both envied and scorned. Today, their legacy endures in the very stones of Blenheim Palace, Chatsworth, and other grand estates that still stand thanks to American fortunes. But it also lingers in the broader story of women's struggles for agency, a reminder of how often they were used as pawns in a larger game of wealth and power. Unfinished reflection by the outbreak of the First World War, the era of the dollar princess. Tonight, we journey back to the late 19th century, to an era of glittering wealth, fading aristocracy, and the curious women caught between them, and the burdens of Europe's old nobility. This is not a story of battles or revolutions, but of dowries' duty. So settle in, let the past unfold gently, and allow this story to guide you toward sleep.